Welcome to Lamenting Souls of the Past. If you are new, hear kindly. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our story. Would also love you to tell us which country or city you are watching from and which event in history would you want us to capture. In case you haven't joined our community, kindly do. Because interesting stories that never made it to the public has been revealed in our community platform. Let's begin our story.
For 18 months, everyone at Blackwood Plantation in Wilkinson County, Mississippi, believed that Elijah Freeman was simply healing minor ailments, fevers, aches, infected wounds. Master Cornelius Blackwood even allowed the 35-year-old enslaved man to circulate among neighboring plantations, carrying his herbal remedies, building a reputation as a miraculous healer. White masters paid for his dark bottles, overseers trusted his ointments, pregnant slave women begged for his teas. But on the night of March 14, 1848, when 7 white men, including 3 slave owners, 2 overseers and 2 slave catchers, began dying simultaneously in indescribable agony, the truth revealed itself brutally. Elijah wasn't healing anyone. He was methodically poisoning, drop by drop, each man who had participated in the lynching of his pregnant wife 6 months before. For half a year, he administered calculated doses of poison that accumulated silently in their bodies, waiting for the perfect moment. That night, when all targets were together on a fugitive slave hunt, Elijah activated the poison with a specific counter-herb distributed in water jugs. What the white men didn't know was that Elijah Freeman wasn't just a healer. He was the son of a captured Igbo priest, master of ancestral African poisons, and had spent 18 months transforming his pain into patience, his rage into science, and his trauma into silent and absolutely lethal justice. But to understand how a healer became an executioner, we must return to September of 1847, when Elijah Freeman still believed in mercy. Blackwood Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Mississippi Delta cottonland, worked by 143 enslaved men, women, and children. The plantation sat 15 miles south of Natchez, in a region known as the Black Belt for its rich dark soil and its overwhelming population of enslaved Africans. By 1847, cotton was absolute king in Mississippi. A single bale could sell for $50 in New Orleans, and Cornelius Blackwood shipped 2,000 bales annually. The wealth was staggering. The brutality required to produce it was unimaginable. The social hierarchy at Blackwood was typical of large, Deep South plantations. At the top sat Master Cornelius Blackwood, 52 years old, third-generation plantation owner who inherited the land from his father and expanded it through calculated marriages and ruthless business practices. He was a tall man, over 6 feet, with iron-gray hair swept back from a high forehead, penetrating blue eyes that seemed to evaluate human beings the way a farmer evaluates livestock, and hands that had never performed a day of manual labor. He wore tailored suits from New Orleans, smoked Cuban cigars, and collected first-edition books he never read. His office in the big house contained detailed ledgers recording every enslaved person's purchase price, projected work output, breeding potential, and depreciation value. To Cornelius Blackwood, slavery wasn't a moral question. It was mathematics. Below him stood his wife, Prudence Blackwood, 48 years old, daughter of a Charleston plantation family. She was thin as a whip, with pale skin she protected obsessively from the sun, graying blonde hair pulled into severe buns, and a perpetual expression of pinched disapproval. Prudence managed the household slaves with tyrannical precision, measuring sugar portions, inspecting dust with white gloves, and punishing the smallest infractions with creative cruelty. She was known throughout Wilkinson County for burning slave women's hands with hot flat irons for wrinkled tablecloths, for forcing girls to kneel on dried corn kernels for hours for broken dishes, for shaving the heads of women she considered too proud. Her Christianity was absolute and merciless. She quoted scripture while ordering whippings. The overseer was a man named Silas Rourke, 38 years old, hired from Georgia for his reputation of squeezing maximum productivity from enslaved workers. He was built like a bull, massive shoulders, thick neck, hands the size of dinner plates. His face was permanently sunburned, scarred from a knife fight in Savannah, with small, cruel eyes and tobacco-stained teeth. Silas carried a whip called Persuader, 15 feet of braided leather with a steel tip that could strip flesh from bone. He used it daily. His philosophy was simple. Fear produces cotton. He woke the field hands at 4 in the morning with bells and whip cracks, worked them until dark with minimal water breaks, and punished any perceived laziness with public floggings. His favorite technique was to whip a slave while forcing the victim's family to watch, creating layered trauma. Silas was paid $800 annually plus bonuses for exceeding production quotas, blood money earned through blood. Below Silas were 2 assistant overseers, Thomas Pike and Jacob Morrison, both poor whites from Alabama who saw their positions as tiny scraps of power in a society that otherwise kept them at the bottom. They mimicked Silas's brutality, hoping to earn his favor and perhaps one day manage their own plantations. Then came the drivers, enslaved men promoted to supervise other slaves. At Blackwood, the head driver was a man named Caesar, 45 years old, who had sold whatever remained of his soul for slightly better food and a small cabin away from the quarters. Caesar enforced the work quotas, identified troublemakers, and delivered the first round of discipline. Other slaves despised him. He despised himself more, but survival was survival. At the very bottom, occupying the hierarchy's foundation, were the 143 enslaved people who actually produced the plantation's wealth. 72 were field hands, men and women who worked the cotton from planting through picking. Bodies bent under the Mississippi sun, hands bleeding from cotton bolls, backs scarred from whips. 31 were skilled workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, stable hands. 23 were domestic slaves working in the big house, subjected to Prudence's constant surveillance. 17 were children too young to work full days, but already learning their future fate. And then there was Elijah Freeman. Elijah occupied a unique position at Blackwood Plantation. He was 35 years old in 1847, standing just under 6 feet tall, with skin the color of polished mahogany, high cheekbones that revealed his West African heritage, and hands that were surprisingly elegant for a man born into slavery. His eyes were his most striking feature, dark brown, almost black, with an intensity that made people uncomfortable. They were eyes that saw too much, understood too much, remembered everything. Elijah had been born in 1812, not in Mississippi, but on a slave ship crossing the Atlantic. His mother, Uneasy, was an Igbo woman from what is now southeastern Nigeria, captured during a village raid when she was 19 years old. She was 7 months pregnant when slavers chained her in the hold of the ship Salvation, bound for Charleston. The Middle Passage took 63 days. 147 Africans were loaded onto that ship. 81 survived. Uneasy gave birth to Elijah in the darkness of the hold, surrounded by death and human waste and the screams of the dying. Somehow, impossibly, both mother and infant survived. They were sold together in Charleston, a mercy only because mother's milk was valuable for keeping infant slaves alive. A tobacco farmer in Virginia purchased them for $650. Uneasy named her son Elijah, a biblical name. She learned from the slaves who had been in America longer, but she also gave him a secret name in Igbo, Chukwebuka, meaning God is great. She whispered it to him every night, along with stories of their homeland, the language of their people, and the spiritual practices that connected them to ancestors. Uneasy's father had been a dibia, a traditional healer and priest who knew the secrets of hundreds of plants, roots, and herbs. He could cure fevers, stop bleeding, ease childbirth, induce visions, and yes, kill silently when justice demanded it. Adaize had learned fragments of this knowledge before her capture. In slavery, she taught everything she remembered to Elijah. By the time he was 8 years old, he could identify healing herbs. By 12, he was setting broken bones. By 15, he was secretly treating enslaved people's wounds, infections, and illnesses with such success that even white overseers began consulting him. When Elijah was 17, his mother died. Dysentery, the official cause. But Elijah knew better. She had been raped by the plantation owner's son. Rather than bear another child into slavery, rather than give her rapist that satisfaction, Adaize had poisoned herself with water hemlock. She died in Elijah's arms, whispering final instructions in Igbo. Survive, remember, when the time comes, make them pay. Elijah was sold south at 18, part of the domestic slave trade that transported over 1 million enslaved people from the Upper South to the cotton frontier. He ended up in Mississippi, passing through 4 different owners before Cornelius Blackwood purchased him in 1838 for $900, a premium price justified by his healing skills. For 9 years, Elijah lived at Blackwood Plantation, occupying a strange middle space. He was still enslaved, still subject to punishment, still property, but his knowledge made him valuable. Cornelius Blackwood allowed him to treat sick slaves. After all, a dead slave was a financial loss. Gradually, Elijah's reputation spread. Neighboring plantation owners requested his services. Blackwood rented him out for $2 per treatment, pocketing the money, but allowing Elijah slightly more freedom of movement than most slaves ever experienced. This freedom came with invisible chains. Elijah had to carry a written pass whenever he traveled. Slave patrols, poor whites on horseback who policed enslaved people's movements, could stop him at any time, demand his papers, whip him for perceived disrespect. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 hadn't been passed yet, but Mississippi had its own vicious laws. Any enslaved person found off their plantation without a pass could be whipped, branded, or sold. Any white person could demand to see papers. Any suspicion of escape plans could result in summary execution. But Elijah navigated this world carefully. He kept his eyes down, his voice soft, his movements non-threatening. He said, "Yes, master," and "No, master," and never ever showed the intelligence burning behind those dark eyes. White people saw a talented slave, useful property, nothing more. Other enslaved people saw something different. They saw a man who listened, who remembered, who treated their wounds with gentle hands and kind words. They saw someone who kept secrets, who never informed on those planning escape, who quietly passed information along the invisible network enslaved people called the grapevine telegraph. They saw a man who sang spirituals with particular intensity, especially "Go Down Moses" and "Steal Away to Jesus," songs that on the surface praised biblical stories but actually contained coded messages about resistance and freedom. Elijah had learned to live in 2 worlds simultaneously: the outer world, where he played the role white people expected, and the inner world, where he remained his mother's son, Chukwebuka, keeper of ancestral knowledge, survivor, silent rebel. For 9 years he endured, for 9 years he healed, for 9 years he waited, not even knowing what he was waiting for. Then he met Ruth. Ruth was 23 years old when Cornelius Blackwood purchased her in 1845 from a plantation in Alabama. She cost $750, priced lower than she should have been because the seller wanted her gone quickly. Ruth had a reputation for being too proud, too defiant, too willing to talk back. She had been whipped 3 times, But each whipping seemed to strengthen rather than break her. The Alabama plantation owner worried she would inspire other slaves to resist, so he sold her south. She arrived at Blackwood Plantation in chains. Elijah first saw her when Silas Rourke paraded her through the quarters as a warning. "This here is Ruth," Silas announced. "She thinks she's special, thinks she can talk back. We're going to teach her different. Any of you feel inspired by her foolishness, you'll get the same treatment." Ruth stood in the Mississippi sun, hands chained, dress torn from the journey, and looked Silas directly in the eye. "I'm not afraid of you," she said clearly. The yard went silent. Enslaved people didn't speak to overseers that way, didn't look them in the eye. This was suicide. Silas smiled. "Well, we'll see about that." He ordered her whipped, 20 lashes, public, immediate. They tied her to the whipping post. The other slaves were forced to watch. As Persuader cracked across Ruth's back, opening skin, she didn't scream, didn't beg, made no sound except sharp exhales through gritted teeth. When it was over, when her back was ribbons of blood, Silas asked, "What do you say now?" Ruth lifted her head and met his eyes again. "I'm still not afraid of you." Silas might have killed her then, but Cornelius Blackwood intervened. "That's enough. She's expensive property. Put her to work in the fields. Let the sun teach her what the whip can't." They dragged Ruth to the quarters, assigned her a place in the women's cabin, left her bleeding on a dirty pallet. That night, Elijah came to treat her wounds. He arrived after dark, carrying a small bag of supplies, clean cloth torn from his own shirt, a clay pot containing salve made from comfrey root and plantain, a jar of willow bark tea for pain. Ruth was lying face down, shaking with suppressed sobs of pain and rage. "I'm Elijah," he said softly. "I can help with the wounds if you'll permit it." "They let you treat me." Ruth's voice was hoarse. "They don't let me do anything. But they don't stop me either. My healing keeps their property valuable." Ruth laughed bitterly. "Property, that's what we are. That's what they call us," Elijah said, carefully cleaning her wounds. "Not what we are." Over the following weeks, Elijah treated Ruth's back as it healed. Slow process, complicated by the fact that she was forced into the cotton fields every day, reopening wounds, collecting infection. But Elijah was persistent. He brought salves, changed bandages, monitored healing, and they talked. Ruth told him her story. She had been born in Virginia, sold to Alabama at 15, had watched her mother work to death, and her younger brother sold away when he was 10 years old. She told him about the anger that lived in her chest like a constant fire, the rage that made her unable to bow, unable to pretend, unable to play the game that kept most enslaved people alive. "I know I should keep quiet," she said. "I know defiance gets you killed. But every time I lower my eyes, every time I say, 'Yes, Master,' I feel like I'm betraying my mother, my brother, everyone who died in chains. How do you do it? How do you survive without breaking?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment. "I don't survive without breaking," he finally said. "I broke a long time ago, but I put the pieces back together in a different shape. My mother taught me patience. She said resistance doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like surviving when they want you dead. Sometimes it looks like keeping knowledge they want destroyed. Sometimes it looks like waiting for the perfect moment. And when does that moment come? I don't know, but when it does, I'll be ready." Ruth studied his face in the dim candlelight. "You're different than you pretend to be. We all are." Their relationship deepened, slowly, carefully, navigating the impossibility of love in a system designed to destroy it. Enslaved people had no legal right to marry, but they created their own ceremonies. On a Sunday evening in June of 1846, Elijah and Ruth stood before the elderly slave preacher in a secret clearing in the woods. With a dozen witnesses, they jumped the broom, the traditional marriage ritual enslaved people used since legal marriage was forbidden. "What God has joined, let no man separate," the preacher intoned. but everyone present knew separation was always possible. Husbands sold away from wives, wives raped by masters, children torn from parents. Love in slavery was an act of defiant hope. For 14 months, Elijah and Ruth built a life within slavery's constraints. They shared a cabin. Elijah continued his healing work. Ruth labored in the fields, picking cotton with bleeding fingers, but came home each night to a man who loved her, who rubbed her aching feet, who whispered stories of freedom. In August of 1847, Ruth discovered she was pregnant. The news filled Elijah with conflicting emotions, overwhelming joy at creating life with the woman he loved, and paralyzing terror at bringing a child into slavery. How could he be a father when he owned nothing, not even himself? How could he protect a child in a world designed to break that child? Ruth saw his fear. "We'll keep this baby safe," she said fiercely. "Whatever it takes. We'll find a way north. Underground railroad. We'll run." "Running is suicide," Elijah said. "The patrols, the dogs, the bounty hunters, pregnant woman and a man they can identify. They'd catch us in days." "Then what? Wait until our child is born a slave. Wait until Blackwood sells our baby when it's 8 years old. I won't let that happen, Elijah. I won't." They began planning in whispers. Elijah used his travel privileges to gather information. He learned about the Underground Railroad, the secret network of safe houses and conductors that helped fugitives reach the north. He made contact with a freed black man in Natchez who claimed connections to the network. The plan was to run in November, before Ruth's pregnancy became too visible, before winter made travel impossible. They would head northeast toward Tennessee, avoiding the well-patrolled river routes. A conductor would meet them near the state line. From there, a series of safe houses would take them to Ohio, across the river to freedom. It was dangerous, probably impossible, almost certainly fatal, but the alternative was raising their child in chains. They told no one, not even their closest friends. Discovery meant death. Every day was an act. Every smile at Silas Rourke, every yes, master, to Cornelius Blackwood, every moment of obedience was a lie covering desperate preparation. Elijah began hoarding supplies, a small knife stolen from the big house kitchen and hidden in the woods. Dried meat and hardtack accumulated slowly. A compass traded from another slave for medical treatment. Every item was a piece of freedom, hidden in secret locations only he and Ruth knew. They picked a date, November 15th, 1847, a Monday night. When Elijah was scheduled to visit a neighboring plantation, he would return late, or rather, wouldn't return at all. Ruth would claim illness, stay in the cabin, slip away after dark. They would meet at a predetermined location 5 miles north, at an abandoned tobacco barn marked on the map Elijah's contact had drawn. From there, freedom or death. But in slavery, there is no such thing as good luck, only varying degrees of catastrophe. On September 21st, 1847, everything came crashing down. That morning began like any other. Elijah woke before dawn in the cabin he shared with Ruth. She was 3 months pregnant now, belly just beginning to swell, morning sickness mostly past. She would work in the fields today. Pregnant slaves received no exemptions until the final month. Cornelius Blackwood's ledgers didn't account for human weakness. "I'll bring you willow bark tea at midday," Elijah whispered, kissing her forehead. "For the back pain." "I love you," Ruth whispered back. "Only 55 more days. 55 days until November 15th. 55 days until freedom. Elijah never saw her alive again. That day, Elijah was away from Blackwood Plantation, treating a fever outbreak at a neighboring property 12 miles east. He left at dawn with written permission, carrying his medical bag. The work took longer than expected. 7 slaves with serious fever, requiring careful treatment and monitoring. By the time he finished, it was late afternoon. He was walking back along the road, enjoying the brief moment of relative freedom, when he encountered a slave patrol. 3 white men on horseback, rifles across their saddles, looking for trouble. The leader, a man named Josiah Crenshaw, was notorious in Wilkinson County for his brutality. He made extra money hunting fugitive slaves, and when there were no fugitives, he manufactured reasons to punish enslaved people, then collected fees from grateful plantation owners. "Boy, where's your pass?" Crenshaw demanded. Elijah immediately lowered his eyes, made his posture submissive. "Right here, sir." He pulled the folded paper from his pocket, handed it up. Crenshaw examined it slowly, deliberately, looking for any irregularity, any excuse. The pass was legitimate, properly signed by Cornelius Blackwood, clearly stating Elijah's permission to travel for medical purposes. But legitimacy didn't matter to men like Josiah Crenshaw. "This says you left at dawn. It's late afternoon now. What took so long?" "Treating fever at the Morrison Plantation, sir. 7 patients. Took considerable time." "You calling me a liar, boy?" The trap was sprung. Answer yes, get whipped for insolence. Answer no, get whipped for agreeing you're a liar. Stay silent, get whipped for disrespect. There was no right answer. "No, sir, I'm just explaining. I think you're running. I think this pass is forged. I think we need to teach you a lesson." Elijah's heart began racing, but he kept his voice calm. "Master Blackwood can verify the pass, sir. If you take me back to the plantation, we'll take you back, after you learn some respect." They dragged Elijah off the road, tied him to a tree, and whipped him. 20 lashes with a bullwhip, shredding his shirt and the skin beneath. Pain like fire across his back, blood running down to soak his pants. He endured silently, knowing screaming would only encourage them. When it was over, they left him tied to the tree. "Let's see if old Blackwood wants to come collect his uppity property." Crenshaw laughed. They rode toward Blackwood Plantation, leaving Elijah bound and bleeding. He hung there for 3 hours before finally working his hands free. By then it was nearly dark. His back was on fire. Blood dried and cracking, but all he could think about was getting back to Ruth, making sure she was safe, making sure their secret was still safe. He stumbled back to Blackwood Plantation after sunset. The moment he entered the quarters, he knew something was catastrophically wrong. The enslaved people were gathered in unusual clusters, whispering, some crying. When they saw Elijah, the whispers stopped. Eyes turned toward him with expressions he couldn't read: pity, fear, horror. "Where's Ruth?" Elijah demanded. An old woman named Dinah stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Elijah. Oh, child, I'm so sorry. Where is Ruth?" "They took her this afternoon. Master called her up to the big house. Said someone reported she was planning to run. Said they found supplies hidden in the woods. No, 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 no. They're secret supplies. Someone had found them, or someone had betrayed them. It didn't matter. Discovery meant death." "Where is she now?" Elijah's voice was hollow. Dinah couldn't speak. She just pointed toward the whipping post in the yard. Elijah ran. Ruth was still tied to the post. They had left her there for 5 hours. Through the afternoon heat, as an example, her back was destroyed. Not 20 lashes, not 50. They had whipped her until the overseer's arm got tired. Over 100 lashes, back torn open to the bone, dress soaked through with blood. But that wasn't what killed her. Elijah fell to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as he touched her face. Still warm. She had been alive recently, maybe just minutes ago. "Ruth, Ruth, please stay with me. I can heal this, I can—" But even as he spoke, he saw the real damage. The massive bruising on her swollen belly, the blood between her legs. They hadn't just whipped her. They had beaten her pregnant stomach, deliberately, methodically, killing the child inside her and Ruth along with it. Who did this? Elijah's voice didn't sound like his own anymore. It sounded like something breaking. Dinah had followed him. Silas Rourke did the whipping, but it was more than just him. Master Blackwood was there, the mistress, two overseers from neighboring plantations, Pike and Morrison, and those slave catchers that brought you in, Crenshaw and his men. They all watched. They all participated, said they needed to make an example, said any slave planning to run would end up like this. She's pregnant, was pregnant. They murdered a pregnant woman. They murdered my... His voice broke. He pulled Ruth's body into his arms, cradled her against his chest, felt her blood soaking into his already bloody shirt. Her eyes were still open, staring at nothing, her lips slightly parted, as if she had tried to speak at the end. Elijah sat there in the dirt, holding his dead wife and unborn child, and something inside him died as well. The part that believed in mercy, the part that believed in patience, the part that believed in anything except vengeance. Around him, enslaved people gathered silently. No one spoke. What was there to say? This was slavery. This was Tuesday. This was life and death, and the absolute power of white people over black bodies. But Elijah was no longer thinking about survival. He was thinking about his mother's final words. When the time comes, make them pay. The time had come. He stayed with Ruth's body until dawn, memorizing her face, whispering promises in Igbo and English, making vows to ancestors and gods and the child that would never be born. I will kill them all, he whispered, every single one who touched you, every single one who watched. I will make them suffer. I will make them beg. And when they ask why, when they scream for mercy, I will tell them your name. At sunrise, Caesar the driver came to collect Ruth's body. Master says you can bury her today, says you can have 2 hours off from work to do it. 2 hours. They murdered his wife and child and gave him 2 hours to grieve. Elijah buried Ruth in the slave cemetery, a scraggly plot behind the quarters marked by wooden crosses and field stones. He dug the grave himself, 6 feet deep, with bleeding hands and a back on fire from his own whipping. Other slaves gathered for the funeral, singing spirituals in low voices. The elderly preacher spoke briefly about heaven and freedom and reunion with loved ones. But Elijah wasn't thinking about heaven. He was thinking about a very different kind of reunion. After the burial, after the 2 hours expired, Elijah was ordered back to work. Silas Rourke was waiting for him at the edge of the cemetery. You done crying, boy? Time to get back to being useful. Elijah looked at Silas Rourke, really looked at him, cataloguing every detail, the red face, the tobacco-stained teeth, the satisfied smirk, the total absence of remorse. Yes, Master Rourke, Elijah said softly, eyes down, voice empty. Good. Blackwood wants you to check on the Morrison place tomorrow. More fever cases. Yes, Master Rourke. And Elijah, you thinking about running like your woman? Don't. We'll hunt you down and make what happened to her look like mercy. Understand? Yes, Master Rourke. Silas walked away, satisfied that the troublesome slave had been properly broken. He had no idea he was already a dead man. That night, Elijah sat alone in his cabin, staring at the empty space where Ruth used to sleep. He didn't cry. Tears were finished. Instead, he began planning with the cold calculation his mother had taught him. 7 men had participated in Ruth's murder. 7 men would die, but not quickly, not mercifully. No, they would die slowly, in agony, wondering what was killing them, unable to stop it, unable to save themselves. Elijah knew exactly how to make that happen. His mother had taught him about a particular poison derived from water hemlock root. In small doses, accumulated over time, it was undetectable. It caused no immediate symptoms. But once a threshold dose was reached in the body, a single activating compound could trigger catastrophic failure of the nervous system. Muscle spasms, convulsions, respiratory failure, death in excruciating agony. The poison was called death's slow patience. It could take months to accumulate, but once activated, death came within hours. Elijah would poison each of them, slowly, invisibly, building the toxin in their bodies while playing the obedient slave, the helpful healer. And when the time was right, when all 7 had reached threshold toxicity, he would activate the poison simultaneously. They would die together in agony on the same night, and Elijah would watch. The plan required patience, months of patience, months of pretending nothing had changed, that he was still the broken slave they thought he was, months of smiling and bowing and saying, "Yes, master," while methodically poisoning every man who had murdered his family. But Elijah had learned patience from the best. His mother had survived the Middle Passage, survived rape and slavery and forced labor, survived for 30 years until choosing her own death on her own terms. She had taught him that enslaved people survive by being smarter than their oppressors, by playing roles, by waiting for the perfect moment. The perfect moment was coming. Elijah began the next morning. Water hemlock grew wild in Mississippi swamps and creek beds. The roots were the most toxic part. A single ounce could kill a grown man if administered all at once. But Elijah wasn't interested in quick deaths. He needed accumulation. Over the next week, during his medical travels, Elijah harvested hemlock roots. He did this carefully in remote locations, wearing gloves made from pig intestines to avoid contaminating himself. He harvested enough root for his purposes, then carefully processed it in secret locations in the woods, far from the plantation. The processing was delicate. He dried the roots slowly, ground them into fine powder, measured exact doses. Too much would cause immediate symptoms and alert his targets. Too little would never reach threshold toxicity. The dosage had to be precise. For each target, Elijah calculated weight, estimated metabolism, planned dosing schedule. Master Cornelius Blackwood weighed approximately 200 pounds. Overseer Silas Rourke, about 220. The others varied. Each required customized dosing. Elijah determined that if he administered 1/4 grain of hemlock powder daily for 6 months, each target would reach threshold toxicity. At that point, a single dose of a counter compound derived from wild parsnip root would trigger the accumulated hemlock into explosive activation. 6 months, September to March, 180 days of patience, planning, and poison. Now he needed delivery systems. This was where Elijah's reputation as a healer became his deadliest weapon. White people trusted him. They sought his remedies. They consumed his medicines without question. Master Cornelius Blackwood suffered from gout and arthritis. Every morning he took a tonic Elijah prepared, a mixture of willow bark, ginger root, and honey. Elijah simply added 1/4 grain of hemlock powder to each daily batch, undetectable in taste, odorless, invisible. Blackwood consumed it religiously. Overseer Silas Rourke had chronic headaches, probably from excessive drinking. He demanded pain remedies from Elijah weekly. Elijah provided pills made from feverfew and peppermint, each containing the precisely calculated dose of hemlock. Silas swallowed them gratefully. Mistress Prudence Blackwood was a hypochondriac who constantly complained of vague ailments. She required daily tonics, stomach remedies, sleeping draughts. Elijah prepared all of them, each one poisoned. The 2 assistant overseers, Pike and Morrison, both worked neighboring plantations, but visited Blackwood frequently. Pike had a persistent cough. Elijah gave him doctored cough syrup. Morrison had back pain. Elijah provided salves and teas, all contaminated. The slave catchers Josiah Crenshaw and his partner Vernon Hayes were harder to access regularly, but both men drank heavily. Elijah discovered they frequented a tavern in Natchez, where enslaved people worked as servers. Through careful bribes and appeals to shared suffering, Elijah arranged for a house slave at the tavern to add his poison to the whiskey bottles Crenshaw and Hayes preferred. The doses were irregular, but accumulated nevertheless. For 6 months, Elijah played his role perfectly, the grieving widower who had accepted his place, the useful property, the talented healer. He traveled between plantations, treating ailments, preparing medicines, collecting his small fees that went into Master Blackwood's pocket. All the while, poison accumulated in 7 white bodies. The poisoners throughout history have understood something fundamental about power. Those who control what enters the body control life and death itself. Medieval kings employed food tasters. Renaissance nobility lived in constant paranoia. But in the antebellum South, white people never imagined their slaves possessed the knowledge to kill them slowly, invisibly. Their arrogance was their vulnerability. Elijah monitored his targets carefully. He watched for any early symptoms that might indicate dangerous toxicity levels before the planned activation date. Hemlock accumulation was generally asymptomatic until threshold, but individual variations in metabolism meant Elijah had to adjust doses occasionally. In December, Master Blackwood complained of unusual fatigue. Elijah reduced his dose slightly for 2 weeks, then resumed. In January, Silas Rourke mentioned intermittent numbness in his fingers. Elijah adjusted the dosage, blamed it on cold weather, and Rourke dismissed it. The most difficult part was psychological. Every day, Elijah had to interact with these men as if nothing was wrong. He had to accept orders from Silas Rourke, bow to Cornelius Blackwood, endure Prudence's sharp criticisms. He had to play the obedient slave while methodically murdering them. The strain was immense. At night, alone in his cabin, Elijah sometimes trembled with suppressed rage. He talked to Ruth's ghost, told her about the plan's progress, counted down the days. But during daylight hours, his mask never slipped. Not once. Other enslaved people noticed something different about Elijah after Ruth's death. He had become quieter, more withdrawn, but grief explained that. What they didn't see was the cold calculation behind his eyes, the detailed mental notes he kept on every target's health, the careful tracking of poison doses and accumulation rates. In February, Elijah made a critical decision about timing. Initially, he had planned to activate the poison in late March, giving full 6 months for accumulation. But he learned that a large hunting party was scheduled for March 14th, a fugitive slave hunt involving multiple plantation owners and overseers. 6 of his 7 targets would be present. Only Mistress Prudence would be absent, remaining at the big house as was proper for white women. The opportunity was too perfect to pass. Elijah adjusted his plan. On March 14th, during the hunting party, he would activate the poison in the 6 men. They would die together in the woods, far from help. It would appear to be some kind of group illness, food poisoning, contaminated water, bad luck. As for Prudence Blackwood, she would die separately, alone in the big house, with Elijah present to watch every second of her suffering. Justice would be complete. In early March, Elijah began preparing the activating compound. Wild parsnip root, carefully harvested and processed, created a substance that would trigger the accumulated hemlock into explosive activity. He made enough for 6 doses, 1 for each man at the hunting party. The delivery method would be water. Elijah learned that the hunting party would camp overnight in a wooded area 15 miles north of Blackwood Plantation. The slaves assigned to support the hunt would prepare food and drink. Elijah arranged to be included in that support team, offering his services in case of injuries or snake bites. No one suspected. Why would they? Elijah was useful property. On March 13th, the hunting party assembled, 6 white men on horseback, armed with rifles and accompanied by bloodhounds. Their purpose was to hunt down a fugitive slave who had escaped from a plantation 20 miles east. The fugitive, a man named Isaac, had been running for 3 days. The hunting party was confident they would catch him by nightfall. Elijah rode in a wagon with 2 other enslaved men, carrying supplies and medical equipment. As they traveled north, Elijah watched his 6 targets laughing, joking, passing a whiskey flask, utterly oblivious to the death already swimming in their veins. Master Cornelius Blackwood, riding his favorite horse, discussing cotton prices. Overseer Silas Rourke, cracking jokes about what he would do to Isaac when they caught him. Assistant overseers, Pike and Morrison, competing to prove their tracking skills. Slave catchers Crenshaw and Hayes, drunk already, bragging about their most brutal captures. 6 men who had murdered Ruth and walked away unpunished. 6 dead men who didn't know it yet. The hunting party made camp as darkness fell. They had tracked Isaac to a swampy area, but lost the trail in fading light. They would resume at dawn. In the meantime, they built a large fire, settled in for the night, demanded food and drink from their enslaved attendants. Elijah and the other slaves prepared a meal: salt pork, beans, cornbread, standard camp fare, and Elijah prepared water jugs, 6 of them, each containing the activating compound dissolved in fresh creek water. "Elijah, bring water," Silas Rourke commanded. "Yes, Master Rourke." Elijah distributed the jugs, making sure each target received a poisoned container. The parsnip compound was tasteless, odorless, completely undetectable. Each man drank deeply, washing down their meal, quenching thirst after a day of riding. Within their bodies, chemistry began. The accumulated hemlock, which had been dormant, stable, harmless, suddenly activated. Molecular bonds broke. Neurotoxins began attacking the nervous system. Cell membranes started breaking down. But symptoms would take time. Elijah had calculated 4 to 6 hours before the activation became catastrophic. Enough time for the white men to fall asleep, for the camp to quiet, for Elijah to position himself to watch. He waited. By 10 o'clock, the white men were drowsy. By 11 they were asleep around the fire, snoring in their bedrolls, rifles at their sides. The other enslaved attendants also slept, exhausted from the day's work. Elijah alone remained awake, sitting at the edge of the firelight, watching his targets sleep. Midnight came. 1 o'clock. The fire burned low. Elijah added wood occasionally, keeping light enough to see by. At 2:17 in the morning on March 14th, 1848, the symptoms began. Josiah Crenshaw jerked awake first, gasping. His body convulsed, back arching, muscles spasming uncontrollably. He tried to scream, but his throat had locked, producing only a choked gurgling sound. The movement woke the others. Within seconds, all 6 men were convulsing, their bodies betraying them, nervous systems catastrophically failing. Master Cornelius Blackwood's eyes bulged from their sockets as every muscle in his body contracted simultaneously. His spine curved backward in an impossible arch. Blood vessels burst in his eyes, turning the whites crimson. Silas Rourke vomited blood and bile, his stomach lining shredding under the hemlock's assault. He clawed at his throat, unable to breathe, unable to scream, dying in silent agony. The assistant overseers Pike and Morrison thrashed on the ground, foaming at the mouth, biting through their own tongues, drowning in blood and saliva. The slave catchers Crenshaw and Hayes experienced full-body paralysis while remaining conscious, the worst fate of all. Unable to move, unable to speak, feeling every second of internal organ failure, watching their companions die while knowing they were next. Elijah stood and walked closer into the firelight, making sure they could see him. Crenshaw's eyes tracked Elijah's movement. Recognition flickered. This was the slave from the road, the one they had whipped, the one whose woman they had killed. "You're wondering what's happening," Elijah said quietly, speaking to the dying men. "Let me explain. For 6 months I've been poisoning you. Every medicine, every tonic, every remedy you took from me contained hemlock. It accumulated in your bodies, silent and patient, waiting for tonight. The water you drank activated it. Now your nervous systems are destroying themselves from the inside." Master Blackwood was still conscious, paralyzed, listening. His eyes showed understanding and terror. "You murdered my wife," Elijah continued, his voice flat, emotionless. "Ruth, you whipped her to death. You murdered my unborn child. You left her body tied to a post like an animal, and you thought you would never pay for it. You thought enslaved people couldn't fight back." Silas Rourke was choking on his own blood, drowning slowly. "Her name was Ruth," Elijah repeated. "Say her name." "Oh, wait, you can't. Your throats are paralyzed. You can't speak. You can't scream. You can only die." Pike's body went into its final convulsion, spine snapping from the force of muscle contractions. "I wanted you to die together," Elijah said. "I wanted you to watch each other suffer. I wanted you to know that a slave, property as you called us, outsmarted every one of you, poisoned you for 6 months, and you never suspected." Morrison's eyes glazed over, brain hemorrhaging. "My mother was Igbo. Do you know what that means?" "Probably not. You never cared about our cultures, our histories, our knowledge. But Igbo priests know secrets. Secrets about plants, about poisons, about patience. My mother taught me, and I used that knowledge to kill you." Crenshaw's heart finally gave out, stopping mid-beat. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking God to have mercy on your souls. I'm just telling you why you're dying. For Ruth, for my child, for every enslaved person you ever brutalized." Hayes was the last one conscious. His eyes held a question. "Will I run?" Elijah read the question. "No, I'm going back to Blackwood Plantation. I'm going to tell them you all got sick. Food poisoning, probably. Bad water. Who knows? These things happen, and then I have one more death to arrange." Hayes's eyes closed. His breathing stopped. Silence fell over the camp. 6 dead men lay around the fire, bodies twisted in death's final agony. The other enslaved attendants still slept, having witnessed nothing. Elijah sat down by the fire, stared at the bodies, and felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, just emptiness. Vengeance hadn't brought Ruth back, hadn't healed the wound, had only created more death. But he had made a promise, and a promise made over a grave is sacred. When dawn came, Elijah woke the other slaves. They discovered the dead white men and panicked. "What happened? What do we do?" "They're dead," Elijah said calmly. "Probably bad water from the creek. We need to get back to the plantation, report this to the authorities." The return to Blackwood Plantation took hours. The enslaved men loaded the 6 corpses into wagons, drove them back in shocked silence. When they arrived, chaos erupted. Mistress Prudence Blackwood emerged from the big house, saw her husband's corpse, and began screaming. Neighbors came running. A doctor was summoned from Natchez. The sheriff arrived with questions. Elijah explained calmly. "We made camp. The masters drank from the creek. I warned them the water might be bad, but they were thirsty. During the night, they all got sick. By morning, they were dead. It must have been poison in the water." The doctor examined the bodies, consistent with severe toxicity, possibly natural poisons from the creek. Water hemlock grows wild in that area. Tragic accident. Accident. The word hung in the air. No one suspected murder. Why would they? Who could have poisoned 6 men simultaneously without being noticed? The funerals were elaborate. Cornelius Blackwood was buried in the family plot with full honors. The other men received similar treatment. The community mourned. Plantation owners throughout Wilkinson County attended, whispering nervously about bad water and tragic accidents and the mysterious ways of God. Elijah attended each funeral, head bowed, expression appropriately sad. No one suspected. But Elijah's work wasn't finished. One more person had participated in Ruth's murder, Mistress Prudence Blackwood. With her husband dead, Prudence now controlled the plantation. She was the legal owner of 143 enslaved people, 3,000 acres of land, and a cotton empire worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She was also a monster who had watched Ruth die and felt no remorse. Elijah had saved a special death for her. After the funerals, after the public mourning period, Prudence summoned Elijah to the big house. "My husband trusted your medical knowledge," she said coldly. "I have chronic stomach pains. Prepare me a tonic." "Yes, Mistress Blackwood." Elijah prepared the tonic in the plantation kitchen under Prudence's watchful eye. But what she didn't know was that he had already contaminated every ingredient in that kitchen over the past week. Every jar, every bottle, every container held traces of hemlock. Unlike the men, who had required months of accumulation, Prudence would receive massive doses over just a few days. She was smaller, her metabolism faster, and Elijah wanted her death to be more personal. For 3 days, Prudence consumed Elijah's tonics, complaining that her stomach pain was getting worse instead of better. "Your medicines are useless," she snapped. "Perhaps I should examine you more closely, mistress," Elijah suggested, "to determine the exact nature of the illness." On the 4th day, Prudence's symptoms became severe. Violent vomiting, muscle spasms, difficulty breathing. She summoned Elijah to her bedroom, demanded he save her. Elijah stood at her bedside, medical bag in hand, and watched her suffer. "Help me," Prudence gasped. "What's wrong with me?" "You're dying," Elijah said simply. "Same poison that killed your husband, but slower, more painful." Prudence's eyes widened in horror. You poisoned—" "Yes, for 6 months I poisoned every man who murdered my wife. And now I'm killing you, not with medicine, with the same poison that's been in everything you've consumed for the past week." No, you can't. Your husband is dead. The overseer who whipped my wife to death is dead. The slave catchers who beat her pregnant belly are dead. And now you. Justice." Prudence tried to scream, but her throat was swelling shut. She clawed at Elijah, weak and desperate. "My wife's name was Ruth," Elijah said, watching her struggle. "She was 23 years old. She was pregnant, and you watched them kill her, watched them destroy her body, murder our child, and you felt nothing." Prudence's convulsions intensified. Her body arched, muscles locking, eyes bulging. "I could save you," Elijah continued. "I know the antidote, but I won't. Because you don't deserve mercy. None of you did." Mistress Prudence Blackwood died at 4:30 in the afternoon on March 20th, 1848, choking on her own vomit, paralyzed and terrified, with Elijah Freeman watching every second of her death. When it was over, Elijah walked downstairs and calmly informed the house slaves that the mistress had died of the same illness that killed the master. "Terrible tragedy," he said. "The doctor should be summoned." The doctor came, examined Prudence's body, noted the similarity to the other deaths. "Some kind of epidemic poisoning," he concluded. "Possibly contaminated well water at the plantation. We should test all water sources." They tested the well, found nothing. The deaths remained mysterious, tragic, unexplained. 7 white people dead in 1 month. And the entire county believed it was accident or illness or bad luck. Only Elijah knew the truth. In the chaos following Prudence's death, with no clear heir to immediately take control of Blackwood Plantation, enslaved people experienced a brief period of reduced supervision. The plantation would eventually be sold to settle Cornelius Blackwood's debts, but that process would take months. Several slaves saw an opportunity. Within a week of Prudence's death, 12 enslaved people disappeared into the night, heading north toward freedom. Without overseers, without organized patrols, without the plantation's normal security apparatus, they had a chance. Elijah helped them. He provided information about safe routes, gave them supplies, shared his knowledge of the Underground Railroad contacts in Natchez, but he didn't join them. "Why not run?" asked an old friend named Benjamin. "You killed 7 white people. If they ever figure it out, you'll hang. Run north with us." Elijah shook his head. "I'm not running. If I run, it validates their claim that we're criminals, that we're guilty. I didn't commit murder. I executed 7 people who murdered my family and faced no justice. There's a difference. The law won't see it that way. The law is what white people created to protect themselves. I don't recognize its authority over me." Benjamin stared at him. "You've changed, Elijah. You've become something different. We all become what we need to survive. Now go. Head for the Ohio River. There are conductors who will help you." Benjamin and the others disappeared into the darkness, carrying hope and terror in equal measure. Elijah remained. Word of the mass death spread throughout Mississippi. Newspapers reported the tragedy. Mysterious illness claims prominent planter and family. Doctors debated possible causes. Religious leaders proclaimed it divine judgment for unspecified sins. Plantation owners throughout the South increased security, convinced the deaths were somehow related to slave rebellions. They were right to be afraid, though not for the reasons they thought. The story of Blackwood Plantation reached other slaves through the grapevine telegraph, the invisible network of communication that connected enslaved people across vast distances, in whispered conversations, in secret gatherings, in coded spirituals. Enslaved people shared the truth they somehow knew. 7 white people had died, and a slave had made it happen. The story grew with each telling. Some versions claimed Elijah had used African magic. Others said he had made a pact with dark forces. Some said he had poisoned an entire plantation. The details varied, but the core message remained constant. Resist, and sometimes you win. Plantation owners noticed the shift. Slaves seemed less fearful, more defiant. Small acts of resistance increased. Work slowdowns, tool sabotage, mysterious fires. The psychological impact of Blackwood's collapse rippled outward. In response, slave codes throughout the South became harsher. Mississippi passed new laws restricting enslaved people's movement, prohibiting literacy education, requiring larger slave patrols. The white population was terrified, though they would never admit it publicly. If one slave could kill 7 white people and escape detection, what were others capable of? Insurance companies raised premiums on slave property. Plantation values decreased. Some families sold their holdings and moved north. Away from the powder keg, they suddenly realized they were sitting on. The Blackwood effect, historians would later call it, a moment when the enslaved demonstrated intelligence, patience, and lethal capability, and the entire system trembled. Meanwhile, Elijah continued his work. He remained at Blackwood Plantation as it underwent transition to new ownership. He treated sick slaves, prepared medicines, maintained his reputation as a talented healer, but everyone who knew him saw the change. His eyes had become harder, colder. He smiled less. He spoke in shorter sentences. The gentle healer had become something else, a living reminder that oppression has consequences, that justice sometimes comes from unexpected sources. In May of 1848, authorities from Natchez came to Blackwood Plantation with questions. Rumors had reached them, whispers that the deaths hadn't been accidental. They interviewed slaves, searching for inconsistencies in stories. They questioned Elijah for 3 hours. He answered calmly, consistently, with perfect documentation of his whereabouts, his actions, his medical treatments. The sheriff found no evidence of wrongdoing. "We can't prove anything," the sheriff finally admitted, "but I'll be watching you, boy. Something about this whole situation doesn't sit right." "I'm sorry you feel that way, sir," Elijah replied, eyes downcast, voice humble. "I only tried to help, tried to heal the sick. I failed. That weighs on me every day." The sheriff had no response. Without evidence, without witnesses, without even a clear understanding of how 7 people could have been murdered simultaneously, he could do nothing. Elijah went free. But freedom is a complex word for an enslaved man. Elijah remained property, remained subject to sale, remained legally a thing rather than a person. The new owner of Blackwood Plantation, a merchant from New Orleans named Francois Beaumont, took possession in June. Beaumont had heard the stories. He summoned Elijah on his first day. "I paid good money for this plantation and its property. I don't want trouble. You're a talented healer. Keep healing, keep being useful. But if I hear even a whisper of problems, you'll be sold south to Louisiana cane fields where life expectancy is measured in years. Understand?" "Yes, Master Beaumont." Elijah returned to work, but at night, alone, he talked to Ruth's ghost. "I killed them all," he whispered. "Every single one. But you're still dead. Our child is still dead. Vengeance didn't bring you back. It only proved I could become a monster when necessary." He thought about running north, claiming freedom, but something kept him in Mississippi. Maybe it was the knowledge that his story was spreading, giving hope to others. Maybe it was stubbornness, a refusal to let white people drive him away. Maybe it was simply exhaustion, or maybe Elijah understood something profound. The fight wasn't just about personal revenge. It was about proving that enslaved people possessed intelligence, agency, and the capacity for long-term strategic resistance. Every day he remained alive and free was an act of defiance. Years passed. The Compromise of 1850 brought the Fugitive Slave Act, making it federal law to return escaped slaves to bondage. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 reignited sectional tensions. John Brown raided Harper's Ferry in 1859, attempting to start a slave rebellion. The country careened toward civil war. Through it all, Elijah Freeman remained at Blackwood Plantation, which had been renamed Beaumont Plantation, treating the sick, keeping his secrets, remembering Ruth. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, when Union troops occupied parts of Mississippi, when enslaved people fled to Union lines claiming contraband status, Elijah was 69 years old. A Union officer interviewed him, collecting stories of slavery for the official record. "Did you ever resist?" the officer asked. "Did you ever fight back?" Elijah looked at the young white man with his notebook and good intentions. "Every day," he said simply. "Every single day we resisted, in ways you could see and ways you couldn't, in ways that killed us and ways that kept us alive, in ways that history will record and ways that will remain secret forever." "Can you give me a specific example?" Elijah smiled, a rare expression on his face, and not a kind smile. "No, some stories aren't for white people. Some stories we keep for ourselves." The officer noted this in his record but didn't understand it. He couldn't. The enslaved had developed entire systems of knowledge, resistance, and survival that remained invisible to their oppressors. That invisibility was the point. Elijah Freeman died in 1866, 1 year after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. He was 74 years old. He died a free man, technically, though he never lived long enough to truly experience freedom. He was buried next to Ruth in the cemetery that had once been for slaves only. No headstone marked his grave. Formerly enslaved people had no money for such things. But those who remembered knew where he rested, and they told his story. The story spread through oral tradition, passed down through generations. Details changed. Some versions claimed he killed dozens of white people. Others said he used African magic. Still others said he led a rebellion. But the core remained true. Elijah Freeman, enslaved healer, poisoned 7 white people who murdered his pregnant wife, and was never caught. Historians would later debate whether the story was true. Documentation was sparse. 7 people did die at Blackwood Plantation in March of 1848 under mysterious circumstances. An enslaved healer named Elijah Freeman did exist in the plantation records, but proof of murder? None existed. Perhaps that was the ultimate victory. Elijah had killed 7 people and left no evidence that white authorities could recognize. He had turned their system against them, used their prejudices and assumptions as camouflage, and walked away free. In the aftermath of emancipation, formerly enslaved people shared stories like Elijah's in secret gatherings. These stories served multiple purposes: preserving memory, celebrating resistance, teaching survival strategies, and proving that enslaved people were never just victims. They were agents, actors, resistors. The white historical record largely ignored these stories. Official histories portrayed slavery as a paternalistic system where contented slaves served benevolent masters until Lincoln freed them. Resistance was minimized, intelligence denied, agency erased. But the stories survived anyway, passed through generations, preserved in oral tradition, coded in spirituals, hidden in folk tales, stories of poisoners and rebels and runaways and saboteurs, stories of people who refused to accept their bondage, who fought back in 1,000 different ways. Elijah Freeman's story became one of many, a drop in an ocean of resistance. But every drop matters. Every act of defiance, no matter how small or secret, weakens the oppressor's power. Today, over 170 years after Ruth's murder, after Elijah's revenge, we tell this story again. Not to glorify violence, not to encourage vengeance, but to remember. Remember that enslaved people weren't passive victims. They were intelligent, strategic, patient, and when necessary, deadly. They resisted constantly in ways large and small, visible and invisible. Remember that oppression doesn't go unanswered. It may take time, it may require patience, but justice finds a way. Remember Ruth, 23 years old, pregnant, murdered for the crime of wanting freedom. Remember Elijah, who transformed grief into purpose, who used the knowledge his mother preserved through the Middle Passage to achieve something white people thought impossible. Remember that resistance takes many forms. Sometimes it's open rebellion. Sometimes it's secret sabotage. Sometimes it's the patient accumulation of poison over 6 months while playing the obedient slave. And remember that the fight isn't over. Slavery ended in 1865, but its legacies persist. Mass incarceration, systemic racism, economic inequality, police brutality, the same dehumanization that allowed Cornelius Blackwood to order Ruth's murder continues in different forms. Elijah Freeman's story reminds us that oppressed people have always fought back, have always been smarter than their oppressors realized, have always found ways to resist. That tradition continues today in every person who refuses to accept injustice, who organizes for change, who uses intelligence and patience to dismantle systems of oppression. If this story made you feel something, rage at Ruth's murder, satisfaction at her avengers' deaths, discomfort with the moral complexity, good. These stories should disturb us. They should force us to confront the brutality of slavery, the intelligence of the enslaved, and the difficult questions about justice and vengeance. Was Elijah Freeman a murderer or an executioner? Did he commit a crime or achieve justice? The legal system of 1840s Mississippi would have called it murder and hanged him for it. But that same legal system allowed white people to rape, torture and murder enslaved people with complete impunity. Can a system that denies personhood to half its population make legitimate judgments about morality? These are questions without easy answers, but they're questions we must ask, because understanding slavery's full reality, including how enslaved people resisted, is essential to understanding America's present. The stories they tried to erase, the resistance they tried to suppress, the intelligence they tried to deny, all of it survived. In oral traditions, in coded songs, in whispered histories passed through generations. Elijah Freeman's story is one of thousands that deserve to be told, each one a testament to human resilience, to the refusal to accept bondage, to the power of patience combined with purpose. So remember this story, share it, let it complicate your understanding of slavery and resistance. Let it remind you that oppressed people have always been agents of their own liberation, even when that liberation required methods the comfortable find disturbing. And most importantly, let it inspire you to continue the fight. Slavery ended. Oppression didn't. The struggle Elijah Freeman joined continues today, requiring the same intelligence, the same patience, the same refusal to accept injustice. His story isn't just history, it's instruction, it's warning,